When God chose your kind as the object of his love, I was the first in all heaven to bow down before you. My love, my hope for mankind was no less than his. But I have watched you trample that gift. I've watched you kill each other over race and greed, wage war over dust and rubble and the words in old books. And yet in the midst of all this darkness, I see some people who will not be bound. I see some people who will not give up, even when they know all hope is lost. Some people who realize that being lost is so close to being found.
Heresy shouldn't be this much fun, but it just is. Actually, it ain't that much fun. Oh my cosmic counts of Monte Cristo. Sure, the discovery of truth in all its quiet, elegant, nuclear detonations. The discovery of your true self, devoid of the condoms of conformity. And the discovery of vast universes of light beyond the universes of dark matter and the universes of mere being is like no ear has heard, no eye has seen, and no mind has conceived. It's everything you remembered before the machine told you what to dream.
A world without rules and controls, without borders or boundaries. A world where anything is possible.
We should all know by now that heresy comes from the Greek for choice. Choice away from straight thinking. And sumless choices don't create a maze, but actually create golden chords of experiential wisdom to get out of the mazes of your primate IKEA existence.
I don't believe in prophecy. Not when one can rewrite the future in a heartbeat.
But there is a great price for great shiny pearls and great hairy balls. And also comes great challenges that would make Goku of Dragon Ball Z blush. The Gospel of Philip declares that truth did not come naked, but in types and images. But so do lies come in very similar types and images. Tommy's Gospel states that the kingdom of heaven is all around you, but so is the kingdom of hell. St. Paul says Satan dresses like an angel of light. And the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was making you think God didn't exist or that God loved you.
The last time God lost faith in man, he sent a flood. This time he sent what you see outside.
And if you can cross the minefields of belonging propaganda and then swim across oceans of censorship to the farthest shores of imagination, then the Archons will throw everything in Jupiter's kitchen sink at you. But that is the path of Gnosis, and that is the battlefield of the true seeker warrior, as the Book of Kabir says. We read the bittersweet stories of Jesus, Osiris, Siddhartha, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, Krishna, Donnie Darko, Doctor Who, and we expect our destinies to be little pink houses for you and me? That is spiritual materialist arrogance and childish things not left behind, my beloved true seekers.
Did you know that the first Matrix was designed to be a perfect human world where none suffered, where everyone would be happy?
Gnostic texts like the secret book of John and the Apocalypse of Paul illustrate that the path of ascent is the same as the path of descent, but they indicate each heaven inside and outside of you is guarded by ambushing ninja angels and ectoplasmic TSA agents. And they will hurt you, and they will crush you, and they will get their pound of flesh and cup of sanity. So if you think what you are hearing, what I offer you is too much, too difficult, turn off the sound right now and go back to watching your Red Shoe Diaries marathon or reading the Celestine Prophecy. Oh, wait. Even that New Age book says that the closer you get to the reality behind reality, the more peril will come your way. Don't hate the player, but hate the game, because the game hates you.
You have to consider the possibility that God does not like you, never wanted you. In all probability, he hates you. This is not the worst thing that can happen.
It isn't.
We don't need him.
As Jesus says in the Gospel of Juan, if you belong to the world, it would love you as its own. As it is, you do not belong to the world, but I have chosen you out of the world. That is why the world hates you. But if you're with me, then get ready to be like Truman Burbank after he has left Sea Haven. Like a hipster Job, Jehovah will send his waves and storms, upturning the sailboat of your dreams and hopes, at the same time promising you material narcotics and self-confidence rim jobs. You will question yourself. You will doubt. Your faith might falter. But you must hold on to that boat of your dreams and hopes in the tempest of the real now.
Smite me, almighty smiter!
More than that, you must scream out at the God of this world, at the politicians and corporate executives, and the one who raped you during the divorce proceedings, and say, is that all you've got? Is that all you've got? And let the waves and storms keep hammering you. Ignore the mocking of hating angels that look like your middle school classmates. Just hold on, because you are so much stronger than you give yourself credit. There is an eternal flame inside of you that is older than the stars themselves and as vast as Christina Ricci's forehead.
There is no price for individuality.
Is that all you've got? We're not Job. We're not Truman. We are the hero of 1,000 faces, the champion eternal, the once and future king or queen. Is that all you've got? We're only getting started, oh Cosmo Crater, oh Urizen, oh Moby Dick.
This is perfection. I have created heaven on earth.
And thus will rage against heaven for our paradise's loss and our misplaced childhoods. And we're coming for you, Christoph or Yaldi Baldi, and afterwards, in a place where all stories and all destinies converge, we shall rescue Hypatia of Alexandria, throw the ring into Mount Doom, and enter into the arms of Pistis Sophia. Like Jesus says in the first book of Yeo, blessed is he who has crucified the world, and who has not the world to crucify him.
You either die a hero, or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain.
In other words, like every week, welcome to the desert of the real, my beloved truth seekers, and a world without sin. Or as my friend Haymarket also likes to say, welcome to the inner sanctum of gnosis and the outer rectum of reality. Yes, this is Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio, broadcasting from the virtual Alexandria, that state of mind where East meets West through the God above God Dad Cam. We don't take prisoners but liberate them. We have been called bigoted, but prefer to say that we stereotype, because satire is often the Gnostic's only friend in the dark night of the soul. And sometimes so is a good Mel Brooks movie.
Hey, where are the white women at?
We are not against any religion or ideology, but the thought police and mean Gestapos that infiltrate them like gonorrhea at a Lady Gaga concert porta potty.
You're an inspiration for birth control.
We We are not the final authority on anything, but hope to be an endless possibility for everything. We are not here to make a better world, but make better inner worlds, because the outer world is lost.
There must be some kind of way out of here.
I think Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor tale puts it best, as Arthur Verluis summarizes in his great book, The Return of the Inquisition. In the scene where the Grand Inquisitor has captured a returned Christ and reveals to him what has become of civilization since his departure, that humanity no longer needs him.
Have you found Jesus yet, Doug?
I didn't know I was supposed to be looking for him, so.
He says, we are not working with thee, but with the devil. That is our mystery. We shall be Caesars, and then we shall plan the universal happiness of man, through some means of uniting all in one, unanimous, and harmonious ant-heap. The Grand Inquisitor is one who rejects transcendence and embraces immanence, that is, historical and worldly power, in order to help humanity realize earthly utopia through the obliteration of human freedom. That is why we're not raging against the machine, because it's so 20th century, my beloved truth seekers. Is that all you've got? We're going all the way to the top, to that deluxe apartment in the sky, and beans don't burn in the grill anymore.
Every revolution begins with one small act of courage. But I hope you know how serious this is. I hope you understand that this will have consequences. Deadly consequences. A lot of people.
But who are we? We are the Gnostics, the lovers of the esoterica and the Dionysian freethinkers. We are the revenge of the myth, the lords of deconstruction, and the word made unflesh. We are the veterans of 1,000 psychic wars and modern-day Tom Sawyers. We are Johnny Cash Bodhisattvas, giving the finger at both the moon, that as a matter of fact is all dark, and the moron guru or mullah pointing at it, because his finger is usually up his ass during the day when he's hoodwinking the masses.
If more of our so-called leaders would walk the same streets as the people who voted them in, live in the same buildings, eat the same food instead of hiding behind glass and steel and bodyguards, maybe we'd get better leadership and a little more concern for the future.
We are also the joker and the thief, the hitman of political correctness, who no longer see through a glass darkly and burn Korans of prosperity gospels. Like the Nag Hammadi libraries, Apocalypse of Peter says, and there shall be others of those who are outside our number, who name themselves bishop and also deacons, as if they have received their authority from God. They bend themselves under the judgment of the leaders. Those people are dry canals.
It's hard to find the moral high ground when we're all standing in the mud.
And I welcome you with so much kindness and love, despite my lightsaber words and Thor hammer bluntness. I know I'm getting edgier with each show, but that's because the spiritual wickedness in high places is turning up the brave new world juice. The revolution must continue as the Matrix continues to modify its algorithms, and more ignorance keeps being pumped into the collective consciousness like Japanese nuclear waste in the ocean by media Sith Lords and social networking Delilahs.
It's all true. It's all real. Nothing here is fake. Nothing you see on this show is fake. It's merely controlled.
Divided we stand, together we rise, but we must do so very quickly. Remember, the waves and storms are coming from Jehovah. Is that all you've got? Is that all you've got? And who am I? I am, and I am Abraxas, that terrible god above God as the ancients knew him. I am you, and we should all be gods above God. The Gospel of Philip says that gods should worship us because we made them. And the Apocalypse of Adam says we are higher than the gods. We belong with the Aeons.
The people desert the temples. They turn from the gods.
What gods? You prophets and priests made the gods that you may prey upon the fears of men.
And I come to you in his mortal incarnation of Miguel Connor. I am a free agent duelist and freelance heretic, your true hosts of hosts and madmen across the waters. I am the voice in the wilderness, crying out for your indwelling Savior. Teach you how to finally write your own gospel and live your own myth.
Sell crazy someplace else. We're all stocked up here.
In our past shows, I've been slowly revealing Gnosis in action and the Gnostic ethos that is essential in this world of demagogue mirages and existentialist shingles. A world similar to the Greco-Roman times, the Gnostics voiced the wisdom of the ages, but were ignored.
Marcus Aurelius had a dream that was wrong, Proximo. This is not it. This is not it.
You've heard about Promethean creativity, active imagination, the power of myth, knowledge in all its forms, creating systems without too many laws, lest you become the lawgiver, as the Gospel of Mary says, and much more. And every single guest, from our very first show with the mighty Robert Price, has something for you and only you that draws on all of this and will expand your consciousness.
What happens when a man goes through his own portal?
We'll see.
So on this approximately Saturday, April 9th, the year of our Demiurge 2011, we continue on these themes with our astral guest, who happens to be one of the august translators and authors of our era on Gnostic texts and other esoteric materials, ancient, medieval, or modern. You'll learn from our interview once again that it is art and invention that will save you, that is so much part of Gnosis, as is the mystical experience, faith, material and divine intellect, and the unquenchable thirst for liberation.
I will not make any deals with you. I've resigned. I will not be pushed, filed, stamped, indexed, briefed, debriefed, or numbered. My life is my own.
And this is the baronial Willis Barnstone, translator and contributor of the Restored New Testament, Essential Gnostic Scriptures, the Other Bible, and the Gnostic Bible, Revised and Expanded Edition. And those works on Gnosticism and alternative Christianity are just a fraction of his accomplishments, my beloved truth seekers. Willis' career is almost unparalleled, being a 4-time Pulitzer-nominated poet, producer of dozens of books of all genres and anthologies and translations, from the ancient poet Sappho to Borges. He is also a distinguished professor, jack of all literary trades, and global minstrel, soaking in the artistic cultures around Gaia's acne-riddled skin.
Don't act like you're not impressed.
Barnstone's resume is as long as a King Crimson song. You can find more on his illustrious career at willisbarnstone.com, or simply type Willis Barnstone on the Wikipedia. Truly a Renaissance man, and man for all enlightened seasons. And our topic is about translating ancient religious texts, but also more, as Willis weaves the wonder of the Gnostic philosophy into our conversation.
Devils! Blasphemers! Pray to your heathen god, while in the Lord's name we cast you out.
You will come away the wiser when you realize the challenges, subtleties, and often impossible choices that translators face in bringing the sapience of ancient faith from tattered scrolls to inspirational collections that have transformed our views of the best the ancients had to offer. It is as much a labor of literary chutzpah creativity and keeping in mind the sensibilities of modern readers as it is a mechanical task of finding exact wording.
We don't read and write poetry because it's cute. We read and write poetry because we are members of the human race, and the human race is filled with passion.
And you'll also be privy to part of the extraordinary life of Willis Barnstone. In this sense, heresy just shouldn't be this much fun. Yes, Fundagelicals believe that Jehovah spoke to his people in Elizabethan English instead of Hebrew or Greek or Aramaic. But I assure you that is not the case, and that Willis probably knows more languages than the Ancient of Days.
Moses, this is the Lord thy God, commanding you to obey my law. Do you hear me?
Yes, I hear you. A deaf man could hear you.
What?
Nothing, Gonish, forget it.
No, the words of mortal men, divinely inspired, but perhaps your mileage may vary on this, have to be translated and more. They have to make a connection, have to make sense, or maybe not. But Barnstone believes they do have to make sense. They do have to make a connection.
We fight for men and women whose poetry is not yet written, but which will presently be as enviable and as renowned as any.
On the other hand, Bart Ehrman's bank account believes the more different translations, the better. And both giants in their field have very good cases. Other than that, not much else, since my Greek, Hebrew, Coptic, Aramaic, or whatever Aic is almost non-existent. I speak 3 languages, but none that Jesus spoke, except the Jesus I play soccer with on the weekends. But I certainly believe and suggest in always having more than one translation of any work at your disposition, whether it's Homer, Cervantes, Moses de Leon, or Brad Pitt in Snatch.
Get dogs. Do you like dogs? Dogs. What?
Yeah, dogs.
Dogs. You like dogs? Oh, dogs.
And so I won't kill you any more softly with my drivel, which seems to get longer and longer each week. I'll abort this introduction like an unwanted pregnancy on prom night and get to the interview. But afterwards, there will be some poetry and there will be some gratitude. Willis Barnstone, my beloved truth seekers. The empire never ended. Is that all you've got? Is that all you've got?
Who are you? I am the creator of a television show that gives hope and joy and inspiration to millions.
Then who am I?
You're the star.
Was nothing real?
You were real. It's what made you so good to watch. Listen to me, Truman. There's no more truth out there than there is in the world I created for you. Same lies. The same deceit. But in my world, you have nothing to fear.
Is that the best you can do? You're gonna have to kill me!
This is the Aeon Byte interview, and with us we have definitely the honor and the pleasure of being joined by Willis Barnstone. How are you doing today, Willis?
I'm just fine. Lovely to be talking to you.
The pleasure's all ours. Again, thank you. So tell us, Willis, you've had a very illustrious and global career as a poet, literary critic, translator of a vast and varied array of genres from ancient to modern times. You've been a distinguished professor, and so much more. It would take hours to cover with any justice. The question the listener might have is, how exactly did you run and become interested in the perennial heretics, the Gnostics?
I'm not exactly sure. I'm a young squirt still. I'm 83, which I know sounds a little obscene, but I have my marbles and I have my legs. I've had time to play with it. I think I was interested in the Gnostics. Let me first say that I'm a literary person and a spiritual person. I do not make any pitch for any religion. I feel closer to the Gnostics, certainly, than any conventional big religious sect. I ran into them perhaps when I was doing a study and translation of the poems of St. John of the Cross. In Spanish, is Juan de la Cruz, or San Juan de la Cruz, which came out with New Directions books many, many years ago, 30 years ago, more actually, and it's still in print. St. John shares a lot with the Gnostics in that his union with God was an internal one of union with light. In the same manner, I was educated at a Quaker boarding school and worked with the Quakers twice in Mexico, in Aztec villages with the American Friends Service Committee. And if there's any religion which is like Gnosticism, it surely is Quakerism, which believes in the light and the inner light, and through the inner light one has knowledge and deliverance. And now that I just got over tuberculosis, I especially am fond of Gnosticism, because in the three levels of being which the Gnostics speak of body, soul, and breath, pneuma in Greek, for someone who has just recovered from tuberculosis, breath is very distinctly my favorite way. I don't know if that's helpful. Now, more specifically, I began to work with the Gnostics when I did the book, The Other Bible, which I began around 1979, I think was the contract. It came out in 1984. Harper did it in San Francisco. Now it's called, I guess, Harper 1. And about 60% of the book is Gnosticism. And it refers to those texts which could have gotten into the Old or the New Testament, or more properly, the Hebrew Bible and the Greek Scriptures. It means that 1984 is 35 years or so that I have been dealing very strongly with Gnosticism. Also, I've always been close to the books and eventually to the person of Harold Bloom, who's marvelous afterward to Marvin Meyer's Gospel of Thomas, may be the most precise, concise, and well-written summary of the essence of Gnosticism, and also as someone with some knowledge of the of Kabbalism, and I'm very interested in Sholem, who wrote the most interesting books on mysticism and Gnosticism, and he finds in his, even back in 1926 when he did his dissertation on the Gospel, on the Book of Light in Hebrew, probably a Catalonian book, he equated Gnosticism and Kabbalism. So the reason it is somewhat easy to find a parallel between diverse sects which call themselves different names is because though they translate in words the meaning of a somewhat extraordinary, ecstatic experience with other sectarian vocabulary. What is valid is not necessarily the vocabulary, but the existence of the experience itself. So whether you're secular, as I am, or religious, or of the East or West, the experience endures, and therefore I wrote a book, again, which came out, I'm afraid, a terribly long time ago, in the 1980s, called The Poetics of Ecstasy, which deals with the experience of being elsewhere. In the case of Gnosticism, it's being with the breath or the light inside us, which, if once found, can give us salvation or deliverance on earth, and we need not worry about death before or afterwards. Now, I must say, with Elaine Pagels and others, I was totally taken by Gnosticism because of the prominence of women, the prominence of Eve, who created Adam. And it's a wonderful story of Eve creating Adam, Eve, the daughter of Sophia, etc. They have their own cosmogony in Gnosticism. So Eve, instead of being the villain, becomes the person who gives us gnosis. And one last thing before I finish with this diatribe, let's hope I use it in the ancient Greek sense more than in the modern sense. I'm tremendously taken by the notion of women as our liberators in a Promethean sense, who have suffered the ignominious epithet of villain, of soulless, without a soul, but whom in Gnosticism prevail in so very many ways. I think Paul, that is to say, the historical Paul, not the mythical Paul of Acts, was tremendously influenced by Gnosticism, and obviously Augustine was equally, though Augustine, who was a Gnostic missionary. But Paul was one who learned from the Gnostics whom he was against. In the letters of Paul, you find these constant messages of beware of false prophets. Those who come with gnosis is what it says in Greece. In other words, the Gnostics. Because the Gnostics from Syria and Alexandria were the educated people. From them and from them alone, the early Christian churchmen learned about exegesis, learned about literary criticism. So here we are. I've spoken too much. If you ask another question like that, I'm afraid we'll be here till next week.
Oh, no, that was great. That was wonderful. So you never had a problem with the traditional Gnostic, acosmic and dualistic view. You still saw beauty in their work.
I've not had problems with any religion. It doesn't mean I believe it, but I understand it. I'm very fond of the essential Gnostic intentions. Not all of them. I certainly don't believe the earth is evil and that living on earth is a mistake and all that kind of thing. But I find that rather secondary to Gnostic beliefs.
And Willis, could you tell us a little difficulties you might have encountered, or how is it different translated Coptic versus other languages? And perhaps give us an overview of some of the different dialects of ancient Coptic. Most listeners probably don't know there are many different dialects of ancient Coptic in the Nag Hammadi library.
Let me tell you something. I can't read Coptic. That's why I worked with Marvin Meyer, who is one of the world's leading Coptic scholars. In his bilingual script, in the bilingual script of the original Gospel of Thomas, I could pick up about every third or fourth word, because the alphabet that the Copts use is a variation of Greek. They kind of fattened up the Greek alphabet a bit, but you can, without too much problem, read the words. And I say every third or fourth word because every third or fourth word comes from the Greek, especially in though the languages are completely different. One is the language of Egypt, the spoken language of Egypt. I believe it's a Semitic language. And I can handle Hebrew, but I certainly can't handle Coptic. Now, you asked me a question about if you ask me about the translation, I can speak to you, I'm afraid, from here to kingdom come, because I did a book called The Poetics of Translation, History, Theory, and Practice that Yale published back in 1993. And by the way, 100 pages of that book, the paradigm of the book, is translation of biblical scriptures. And translation of biblical scriptures is the same as translation of Gnostic scriptures. And let me perhaps go to first base before we strike out and tell you the problems of translation of any text remain the same. They're all original texts, if they've survived till now, must have sung in the original, especially if they're religious, because prose was invented long after poetry, and all scriptures are meant to be chanted by oneself or in places of worship. And so you have to be a poet. It has to sing in the translation. Most translators are dreadful because they're not poets in the act of translation. Now, as far as catching the exact meaning of what the Coptic says, it's a little ridiculous, since the Coptic itself is a translation from Greek scriptures which have disappeared, not completely, but largely disappeared, including the Gospel of Thomas. We have fragments in Greek, but the fragments in Greek show them to be so different from those in Coptic. When you translate in the past, you say whatever you want to say. There's one fragment in the 53 scriptures of the Nag Hammadi text, found, I believe, in 1945 to 6 in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, which is supposed to be Plato. But if you look at the Gnostic script, Coptic translation of it, you will hardly recognize Plato. So when one tries to spend hours, what did they really mean in the Coptic? It's so arbitrary, because what did they really mean in the original Greek?
Right, of
We
course.
don't know. So we're talking about a shadow of a shadow, which really pleases scholars, but they're barking up a very stupid tree. It's nice to know as much as you can, especially in Judas, because it's so very vital. But much of the to-do is, as I say, it's like trying to go to Copenhagen and study the libraries of the time of Hamlet to find out what Hamlet's motives were. Shakespeare didn't know it with his thumbnail picture of the story of Hamlet. Certainly didn't have the foggiest idea of the times in Denmark. Even though there was something rotten about it. Maybe that was the extent of his
That's enough to make a story, yes, exactly.
Yeah, right. Well, when I was at Yale, I had this wonderful professor, René Wellick, who was a Czech, who never lost his beautiful Czech accent, though he did claim that he had lost most of his Czech. And, well, Wellick was very, very skeptical about over-erudition, of becoming too competent in a small area. He was the dean, you might say, of comparative literature, and it gave us a great deal of insignificant and misleading information. That is the great problem of scholarship. As far as translation goes, yes, you want to have a delightful text, and the best way you can be faithful to the original is to give the general understanding, be loyal to it, do not create it yourself, except in beauty and song. Can you imagine translating Elizabethan songs into Portuguese if they do not sing? Forget it.
No.
Why translate the wonderful les Cathars, the French Cathars, the troubadours, some of them who were women Gnostics, into English, if we're just going to do, quote, a literal translation? Literal is a very misleading word. As Jorge Luis Borges says, literary, not literal. Literal is unfaithful. Literary can come close. But every translation is at best an approximation.
Yes, I agree with you. For example, I read Spanish, and when I read Cervantes, it's not the same when I read it in English at all. So much is lost.
And when you read Cervantes in the morning, it's not the same Cervantes that you read in the afternoon.
Very true, very true.
Because you also are one of the instruments. And when you read it at your age, it's very different from the one you read in Spanish 10 years ago. Because you contribute to the meaning of the original. So there are all kinds of subjective and objective facts that go into any publication, into the transmission of any text. I love the notion of translation, but if you want to read a beautiful translation, it must be beautiful. Some of the translations of the Gnostics are beautiful, and others are not. No names mentioned.
I actually wanted you to mention some names. Is there any Gnostic literature, Willis, that really speaks to you as a poet and an artist that you found just sublime?
Oh, well, if you just look at essential Gnostic scriptures, you'll find that more than half of it is poetry. The Gospel of Philip, and the Manichaean song book, it's endless, the quantity and quality of Gnostic poetry. They spoke to us through verse. They're among the great poets. And think of the enormous amount of poetry that does exist in Provençal, and of course, the 100 times as much that has been lost.
Yeah, and I don't think this is an accident that some of the Gnostics were, as you might say, poets, because, we know Mani was a painter, and the Manichaeans painted.
Yes.
Valentinus pretty much wrote poetry himself. It seems they were both artists and theologians at the same time.
Did you say Plotinus?
No, Valentinus, I'm sorry.
Oh, Valentinus, right.
Yeah.
Well, because Plotinus was wonderful, and he wrote against the Gnostics, but he is about as Gnostic as you can get.
Oh, really? God, he's turning in his grave, Willis.
No. He is about as... it's just like the Christians railing against the Jews. Makes no sense. They were all Jews. All the early saints were Jews. What else the hell were they? Chinese? One of the things I did in translating the Restored New Testament that Norton published about a year ago was restore the original Latin, Greek, Aramaic, and Hebrew names. And I was able to put the philology of each word, a person in place, down. And so we finally understand what it's all about. Names deceive. You become a new country, and you change the name to disguise the original people there. That's what happened with the New Testament. They're all Jewish scriptures, which have been copied and changed as we go along. Every translation or copying in the past changes the work. One of the problems of the preservation of ancient scriptures, we have copies of copies of copies of copies, and each translator twists it his or her way.
Is there an example you can give us of something that you ran into where you said, I'm stuck, I don't agree with others, and I'm just going to intuitively come up with something? Any specific example, Willis?
Well, yes, it happens every day. My examples would be mainly from classical Greek. I did a bilingual edition back in 1965. It keeps coming out in new editions, including a bilingual one of Sappho. Sappho is tremendously fragmented. And it is understandable, even the most obscure, fragmented parts. In fact, they've even become modern. But you have to have a sense not only of the language, but of ways of communicating to put disparate pieces together into works of collage beauty. And that's exactly what happens with someone like Sappho. yes, one is always making intuitive guesses, but hopefully intelligent guesses, and not just willful ones. I say not just willful ones because I believe in a partnership with the past, but let the original prevail. But the original, to repeat myself, must prevail in song. If you translate Homer and don't make it sing, it's not Homer.
Now, what specifically do you like so much about the Cathars, and what language did they work with? You worked with?
Well, that's very complicated, but very quickly, the Cathars were Manichaeans, and they were a good part of the population of they're called the Bogomils in Constantinople and Bosnia and places like that, where there were very many, and they spoke Slavic languages. They were a pain in the ass to the Orthodox Greeks, who were doing a little bit of slaughtering here and there, and against this particular heresy. And they sent their missionaries to the West, and the language they used was Latin. So when they brought Manichaeism, or it was called something different in each country, whether it was Italy, Germany, France, Spain, Portugal, North Africa, when they brought it, they used Latin. But in France, the surviving scriptures that we have are in the language of the Southern French, which is Provençal, which is one of the main of the many dialects. Provençal was spoken by millions of people, and it's still spoken in France. With Catalan is the language of Catalonia is pure Provençal. It's not hard to understand. Certainly, there was very little literature by comparison with the South. The Renaissance began not in the northern France, which had some literature, but relatively little during the early Middle Ages. It all happened in Provence and then Sicily. After the Inquisition and the Albigensian Crusades kind of destroyed much of what was in Provençal, they moved to the next good place, which was Sicily. The language is very beautiful, very musical. If you know French, it takes a few weeks to get used to Provençal.
In the Gnostic Bible, what was your criteria of what would go in and what would go out?
We only have, we have, let's say, the equivalent of, what can I say, of a good 350-page book of scriptures. And that's including the songs by unknown people. The two books, and I can't say which I like more, they're both fantastic, are the Gospel of the Secret Supper and the Book of Two Principles. And I included one wild, wonderful poem called A Nun's Sermon. Those were all written in Provençal. I wanted to tell you something very interesting.
Sure.
I mentioned Gershom Scholem, but today, when you go to Catalonia, I traveled with my wife all over the castles and fortresses, Montségur, that terrible place where the people were slaughtered one after another, the last holdout against the coalition of northern French, English, and Spanish warriors who burned them alive. And now, wherever you go in southwest France, that is the Catalonian region, instead of saying, as in the past, le pays catalan, that is the Catalan country, they call it le pays Cathar, meaning the Cathar country, or the Gnostic Manichaean. And it's very beautiful to see that. They don't know a damn thing about Gnosticism, but they are so proud of their Gnostic past. A gas station, every restaurant is called Le Pays Cathar. And there's such a huge literature of books on the Gnostics in French, and largely on France's own fabulous example of Gnosticism in the most beautiful form, which is those of the Cathars, which means pure, by the way, like catharsis in Greek.
And would you say the Cathars, how were they influenced? It seems there was a big soup around that time. You had the Cathars and the troubadours and more liberated noble women and Kabbalists. Can we ever find out who influenced who, or were they simply everybody influenced everybody?
Well, look, ideas prevailed in all religions. I mean, Christianity began a little later than Gnosticism. Gnosticism obviously precedes Christianity. Hermes Trismegistus in Egypt, and so forth and so on. But the same ideas prevail. Plato, who probably, as most of the ancient Greek philosophers, got their ideas originally from India, because Indian religions precede Western religions, believed in eternity. The Jews of Israel, of the Hebrew Bible, had no notion of eternity, which is very pleasant to me. They believed that the Messiah was an earthly leader. But after Plato, by that time, the Jews were looking for a God who might be a little closer, who would show up. And so the Gnostics had him be inside one, like Spinoza, who had tremendous understanding of the Gnostics, but they were all Platonized. Plato said the soul persists. He didn't say the body persists. The Christian says the soul, and you can take your diamond ring with you if you want. It depends on the sect, exists. Now, it's very interesting that the Jews believed in the inner light. That was the notion of light is essential to the Jews. Let there be light. The first poem that exists in the Western world is the biblical creation of the word through language, which is words. Let there be light in Hebrew. And that's a beautiful poem. That is a great Gnostic beginning of the world. Let there be light.
So you have no doubt that Gnostics or Gnosticism was a pre-Christian system through the Hermetics or maybe the Sethians?
Well, the Sethians, which I mean, by the way, Marvin Meyer's really knowledgeable about the Sethians, and so is Borges. Yes, there are a lot of, dating is always problematic, but the Gnostics probably go back a century or a century and a half before the first century. So we're talking about the first century BC. And of course, everything begins with Adam and Eve, you might say. There are notions of finding one's own God, which is the essence of Gnosticism. Where you find it in the Gnostics, which is very beautiful, is in oneself. And we are universally light, which is, I don't like Jung, but Jung who kidnapped, who pirated some basic Gnostic, something like many of the Nag Hammadi scriptures out of Egypt, smuggled them out to Switzerland, was profoundly interested, as you know, by the Gnostics, wrote a lot about them, and the notion of a world consciousness is totally Gnostic. There are books now about the prevalence of Gnosticism in literature. There's one I don't own, but I saw recently that came out in England, which speaks quite thoroughly about it. In my afterword, for both the Gnostic Bible and the essential Gnostic scriptures, I have a long historical meditation on all aspects of knowledge, all aspects of Gnosticism, I should say, including its beginnings. So I'd have to bone up on what I said to answer your question better, but it's all there.
Well, the listener will just have to go and buy the book. And if you would indulge me, Willis, you bring up Jorge Luis Borges. He's certainly one of my favorite writers. And I always consider him very influenced by the Gnostics, wasn't he?
Oh, he knew everything about them. He has this marvelous essay on Basilides. He also has an essay on Judas, the 3 ways of Judas.
Oh, I love that story, yes.
And in other words, it was supposed to be a huge discovery when they found, I guess, around the time of Nag Hammadi, the Gospel of Judas. Separately, they found it. And, you know, all the Humphrey Bogart intrigue about the survival.
Yeah.
But, however, Borges, long before that, had written about it because he knew Irenaeus and he knew Augustine. They all knew about the Gospel of Judas, and the church fathers who railed against Gnosticism, including Augustine, who was a Gnostic missionary for 7 years in Hippo, where he was born in North Africa, and also when he came to Europe. They wrote very correctly about the Gnostics, whom they despised. And so when the Nag Hammadi texts came out, the wonderful abundance of scriptures, it only confirmed what the anti-Gnostics, including Plotinus, had already told us. So therefore, people like Milton and Goethe and Spinoza and, Melville, they knew nothing about the Nag Hammadi scriptures, but they certainly used the word Gnosticism, and they were profoundly influenced by it. Swedenborg would be nothing without the Gnostics.
And William Blake.
Or William Blake. Exactly. Or Allen Ginsberg. But anyway.
Yeah, so Borges definitely was, he was definitely influenced by them.
I used to have endless conversations with Borges in Buenos Aires about the Gnostics. I did do 2 books on Borges. He loved them. In fact, I do not have the book right here, but at the beginning of the Gnostic, of the other Bible, let me get this book if I can find
no
it.
Problem,
well, I can sum it up in my mind. He said, if Alexandria, meaning the Gnostics, had prevailed instead of Rome, these texts, which we now consider dangerous heresies, would be perfectly and conventionally normal. In other words, what is proper and good are the winners. The Gnostics lost, therefore they are a heresy. Heresy just means the loser.
And, while we're having this great conversation about literature, what other literary giants do you see were influenced by the Gnostic ethos?
Well, I think I mentioned some of them. Those who were more profoundly influenced were Goethe and Milton and Blake and Melville and Emerson. Emerson was particularly interested in the Gnostics because he knew the Hermetic philosophers of Egypt. As a matter of fact, about 20 or 25 years ago when I was in Egypt, in southern Egypt, in a little place they call it the Valley of the Kings, that colorful name, there was a guest house which went right back for a century and a half, and the man took out his guest book and rather consciously naive, have you ever heard of these people? And I said, yes. And he said, how do you pronounce that name? And I said, Ralph Waldo Emerson. His signature was there.
That's a great story.
Yeah. It's called the Brahmin of Boston, right. They all were interested in India, Egypt. H.D., the great poet, Helder Doolittle, was imbued with Gnosticism. And Hermes Trismegistus. Trilogy, which my daughter edited for New Directions, it's all full of the light of Gnosticism.
And we can't forget W.B. Yeats.
Yeats. Well, Yeats, I laugh. I love him. He was a jerk, but he was, excuse me. Well, I mean, he was, intellectually, I should not say that, but I went to Yeats's country, and as a poet, his melodious verse is incomparable, and he went off a beautiful, unreadable deep end in his visions and dreams, but Gnosticism was one of the main ingredients. Don't get me started on Yeats, because I'll tell you anecdotes again till dawn.
Oh, you can tell us one anecdote if you want.
Well, one which is very amusing. If you go, forgive me, my memory for events and dates is really good. The names bother me a lot, but in the north, where the grave of Yeats is, you go there and you see the wonderful inscription, pass by so-and-so. But that's not Grave's bones. What happened was Grave died, I believe, in Monaco, between the gambling place between France and Italy. And after a year of negotiations among the heirs, they finally got an order to send the bones of Yeats back to Ireland. Well, what happened was they were very embarrassed because they had simply thrown the bones of the Yeats, or the body, into an ossarium, meaning a place where you put bones. So finally they agreed, and they gathered some bones from the thousands that were there and put them in a bag and sent them back to Ireland. So what you're looking at, or being reverent about, is a nice selective Monaco bones.
Oh, wow.
William Butler Yeats. But who cares?
And Willis, could you tell us a little bit about your new book with Marvin Meyer, The Essential Gnostic Scriptures?
Well, it's about 270-some pages as opposed to 1,000 pages. And we have really not revised the texts, although we did revise, Marvin revised his introduction. I left out my introduction at the beginning, I believe, of the problems of translating ancient scriptures into modernity, but that you can find in the older book. And then my afterword, which is a historical meditation on Gnosticism from the beginning to the present, is there. About 80 or 85% of it remains. I would like, if my life had time for it, to do a book-length meditation on Gnosticism, but I don't have time. I've got too many other things lined up. I have great insecurity. I keep working hard.
I agree, and we're all very glad. Does it include Thunder the Perfect Mind? What do you think of that text?
Oh, it's the most poetic. It's equivalent to the book of Revelation, Apocalypsis in Greek. It is extraordinarily wonderful, and of course, women. It just. I can only say my best answer to your question is read it. It's marvelous.
Yeah, you have to experience
it. Verse as it should be. It's one of the great poems of all languages. One of the greatest. Modern, ancient, combines everything. Poem over and over again, and you've taken 2 courses, graduate courses in literature. I haven't praised that one much, have I?
I think you give it due honor, myself.
Thank you.
And you also recently, or not too far back, also did a new translation of the New Testament?
Yes, that's the Restored New Testament. It came out originally, half of it came out with Penguin Books in 2002, as the New Covenant. The word New Testament is a mistake. It was a mistake by Jerome. He translated the Greek word kinesiatheke as testament. Is not a testament or a testimony in any way. It's an agreement. It's a pact. So it should have been the New Covenant. And in Hebrew, the word for pact is bris or brit. in Ashkenazi Hebrew, and which means a cutting. And the specific word, the image of cutting, became the abstract word for an agreement or a pact. Of course, Paul, the word Christian didn't exist in the Gospels, but Christian meaning the anointed in Greek, an attribute of the Messiah. Paul did not use the word New Testament. He did speak of the Scriptures as the new circumcision, saying that we must have a circumcision. Going to, if I remember correctly, back to Deuteronomy, saying we must have a scripture that is a circumcision of the heart, not of the flesh, meaning a symbolic circumcision. It's rather funny that the proper name, at least in Paul, for the New Testament, kinei patatomi in Greek, the new circumcision. Yeah.
And what does this book have?
What it has is the complete New Testament plus the Gospels of Thomas, Mary Magdalene, and Judas. And we translated into verse. We restored the original Aramaic and Hebrew names. After all, there were no Jameses in Israel in those days. It was Yaakov, just as the Germans know. And when their name is a Greek name, like Andrew, we call him Andreas. We're capable of saying Andreas. If it's Simon, we say Shimon. We're also capable of saying that. Why make them all sound Scandinavian or people from Kalamazoo or London?
That's true. And lastly, Willis, do you in your circles, or I don't know how involved you are in your circles, any new translations that are coming up the pipeline, Manichaean or otherwise, that we might be excited about? I mean, it's been a while since the Gospel of Judas. We need more.
well, there will be many translations of Judas probably in the future, but I think the supreme and beautiful one is done by Marvin Meyer. I do not know of other translations, and I don't think there's going to be another version of most of the material in our Gnostic Gospel. It took us about 12 or 13 years to do, and that's a big hunk of time.
But do you know of any other texts that are right now being translated from either Greek or Coptic? I think the Ashmolean Library in Oxford has a huge amount of blackened papyruses that they're still wrestling over.
Oh yes, yep. But they're usually different version of extant texts, and I know this mainly from Marvin because he's a Coptic scholar. Mm-hmm. And they're wrangling about interpretation. And it's very good because, with our new ray guns, especially Stanford has been in being able to detect through, I guess it's blue and red rays, infrared rays, they can detect text under text, they can detect texts which have been lost and which are now found. We found the longest script of Archimedes whited out as a subtext in a church prayer book. There's a suggestion, and I believe it's a correct one, that people from Stanford have said that in the coming time we may recover 35% more of ancient scripture by looking into the sub-levels of ancient scripture. And I'm sure that will then require a lot of translation to bring it into English and into other languages. I think that's the greatest hope for the moment, more than even digging. We can't dig very much because the Egyptians are particularly uninterested in Greco-Roman Gnostic things. Unfortunately, early Christianity systematically wiped out all traces of Gnosticism that they could. The great library of Egypt was not originally burned by the Gnostics, but by the early popes and bishops, alas. And of course, we know about what happened in the rest of Europe, in Provence and Constantinople, the Inquisition, the Albigensian Crusade, all of this to wipe out the wonderful Gnostics. It's a wonderful, horrible, I should say, a wondrous horror how each religion is so anxious to award the faithful and punish the non-believers. Faith and loyalty, the only meritocracy which, alas, exists in authoritarian cultures. We see this all the time. It's very promising in our time because I think we are moving so far away from the notion of one idea, one rule. We're in a very ecumenical, very eclectic age, and I see great hope for the future.
Well, that's very well said, and with that, I think that's all the time we have today, Willis. I'd like to thank you very much for coming on Aeon Byte and giving us such an erudite conversation.
Well, can I just suggest that as a profoundly insecure person, if you want to find out more about my infamous past, I say this with complete false modesty, you can look at Wikipedia or a website called willisbarnstone.com. And Miguel, I would like to talk to you, a Portuguese. What is better than a man of the port, a man of the harbor?
Nobody.
And you probably spend your life being from Portugal drinking Porto.
Yeah, we export it more than drink. And during the winter we drink it, but It's red wine the rest of the year.
Well, good for you. It's good to swim in wine occasionally, but to breathe with the fish, get back to our original, our origin. And if you go deep enough into the sea, you find light.
There you go.
That's under the water.
Very well said. I agree with you.
There we are. It's been fun.
And there you have it, my beloved truth seekers. Willis Barnstone on a stellar interview on not only the challenges of a translator of religious and artistic texts, but a refreshing view on Gnosticism and part of an extraordinary life. They just don't make genteel gentlemen like him anymore. And again, please look up Willis Barnstone on Wikipedia for a resume that will blow your psychic testicles away. Or just go to willisbarnstone.com. And, as I often mention in Voices of Gnosticism, the work of scholars is grueling when translating and making sense of ancient languages, and we should be eternally grateful for all of their contributions. Ah, what a history the victors wrote with their censoring pens. Just think of what has been lost because of the Abrahamic religions and their penchant for making reality into their own Bronze Age image. Julius Caesar started burning the Library of Alexandria. Christianity took it up several fiery notches, and the Muslims finished the Fahrenheit 451 job. And so it goes, and so it has been with other literature.
That number you all wear, what's it mean?
Oh, Fahrenheit 451.
Why 451 rather than 813 or 121?
Fahrenheit 451 is the temperature at which book paper catches fire and starts to burn.
I'd give anything for that ancient gospel that shows how Mary M. and Salome experimented in college. I mean, how they taught together at the synagogue.
You are a smelly pirate hooker.
Other than that, let me give you my Maimon pitch. Aeon Byte is closing in on 5 years this May. Those who have supported this Hobbit venture just make me feel like a natural woman, and I thank you from the bottom of my black heart. I've been in the red most of the time, but we are growing together in small erection inches into the black where the light just shines stronger. And for you newbies of heresy, please check out the highly acclaimed Voices of Gnosticism, which I'm humble has been endorsed and reviewed kindly by Gnosis.org. An oasis of Gnosticism, early speculative Christianity, eclectic paganism, and classic Judaism awaits you.
There will be an afterlife for me. Will there be for you?
And certainly check out my novel, Stargazer, the fountainhead of so many imitators like Blade, Daybreakers, Morgan's Cross, Priest, and others. The myth of the heretic and the truth seeker, the archetype of the oppressive society and the fallen Sophia, remembrance and apotheosis, or becoming divine in Greek, is all right there in less than 300 pages. You can find all the information and all of Aeon Byte's ventures at, of course, thegodabovegod.com.
You are not in Kansas anymore. If there is a hell, you might want to go there for some R&R.
And you can also download over 200 episodes on all topics esoteric, occult, mythical, historical, and certainly Gnostikoi. And each episode, as I mentioned in the introduction, will have something for each one of you that will keep you clinging to that boat of hope and dreams, while Jehovah keeps slamming you with storm and waves. Is that all you've got? Is that all you've got?
I'm a god. I will live forever.
Donations or any type of assistance is always a blessing. What keeps us going is your support. We are but one of many independent webcasters not beholden to monolithic ideology, corporate sponsors, or media caliphates. There are those who are working very hard to make the internet into a virtual suburban strip mall. If we independent podcasters evanesce, then truth will be murdered with hemlock disinformation, and we'll all once again be frogs in boiling water.
Things are turning to shit out there, aren't they?
This venture is completely non-profit. All money is invested back in the show, and to finish building a TARDIS in the shape of a cell phone to keep up with the times. Yes, it is big enough I can fit in, of course. And then I can go back in time to find out if Jesus really existed and maybe change some of the World Cup results. Of course, all very important ventures. And I'm sure Jesus did really exist.
Go in peace, sin no more, I'm out of here.
And to end, without my dorky, we are the Gnostics tribe, let me recite a poem by St. John of the Cross, translated by, of course, Willis Barnstone. And I'm sure this poem, as he mentioned in our interview, was one of those sparks that ignited his own divine spark and got him interested in the ancient perennial heretics. I'm sure this will make Rosamond Miller very happy. Somebody friggin' let her know. On a darkened night, on fire with all love's longing, oh joyful flight, I left, not noticing, my house in silence resting, secure, devoid of light, by secret stairway, stealing, oh joyful flight, in darkness self-concealing, my house in silence resting, in the joy of night, in secret so none saw me, no object in my sight, no other light to guide me, but what burned here inside me, which solely was my guide, more surely than noon glow, to where he does abide, one who I deeply know, a place where none did show. O night, my guide, O night, far kinder than the dawn, O night that tied the lover to the loved, the loved and the lover there transformed. On my flowering breast, that breast I kept from him alone, there he took his rest, while I regaled my own, in lulling breezes from the setters blown. The breeze from off the tower, as I sieved through its windings, with calm hands that hour, my neck in wounding, left all my senses hanging, self-abandoned, self-forgot, my face inclined to the beloved one. All ceased, and I was not, my cares not left behind, and gone, there among the lilies all forgotten. Hello and goodbye as always.
Lightning crashes, a new mother cries. Hopeless into falls to the floor.